Hello, everybody. This is Ariadne Rainbird, and today I'm going to be talking about the trickster and shadow archetype in Welsh myth, in particularly the four branches of the Mabinogi. This talk was originally prepared for a module from a master's degree in Indigenous culture, and so I'm going to start off by exploring Welsh culture as an Indigenous culture. So the terms Indigenous culture and Indigenous peoples generally refer to people inhabiting or existing in a land from the earliest times or from before the arrival of colonists. The online Cambridge Dictionary defines Indigenous as used to refer to or relating to the people who originally lived in a place, rather than people who moved there from somewhere else. Although it can be argued that all peoples moved to most places from Africa originally, if we are to accept the out of Africa origins of the human race, Indigenous would refer to the very first settlers of a particular place, those who have been there since prehistory. The Welsh can arguably be considered to be indigenous to Britain. Welsh is the oldest British language, and prior to the Anglo-Saxon migrations and settlements, was spoken widely across what is now England as well as Wales. The Welsh word for Wales is Cymru. The word for Welsh language is Cymraeg, and the word for Welsh people is Cymru, which likely comes from the Brythonic word Cymrogi, meaning fellow countrymen. The word Wales, however, comes from the Anglo-Saxon walas, meaning foreigners, a term which alienates the Welsh from their own land. Thus, by using the English word to describe themselves, the Welsh can also be seen as continuing this alienation from their own land and culture. Paul Haug, in his article Indigenous People of Wales and Beyond on Favs News Online, argues that the Welsh are an indigenous Celtic nation and ethnic group native to Wales and distinct from other residents of the United Kingdom. He argues that the Welsh share many characteristics of UN-designated Indigenous people and have the right to be recognised as such. He describes Indigenous people as distinct social and cultural groups sharing collective ancestral ties to the lands and natural resources where they live, or from where they have been displaced. He goes on to argue that these lands and natural resources are inextricably linked to their identities, cultures, livelihoods, as well as their physical and spiritual well-being, and that many such peoples maintain language distinct from the official language or languages of regions where they reside. Research by Professor Donnelly of Oxford University, which surveyed 2,000 people across rural Britain, suggests that the Welsh are the most ancient Britons, with DNA which can be traced back to the last ice age 10,000 years ago, and are genetically distinct from the rest of mainland Britain. Haug argues that although Indigenous people make up only 5% of the world's population, they make up 15% of the extreme poor, being more likely to live in poverty, and that the Welsh have suffered poverty at the hands of the English since the death of the last truly Welsh Prince of Wales in 1282. The English exploited Welsh natural resources such as coal and slate, taking ownership whilst the Welsh worked the mines in appalling conditions for their English masters and overlords, with Wales being the world's largest producer of coal back in 1913. Haug argues that Indigenous peoples have been marginalised and have almost been wiped out of existence, along with their native wisdom, but that we can learn from each other, and that through recognising and honouring other ethnic peoples, we can work together excuse me, to regain respect for all Indigenous cultures. The spirit of the Cymry continues to exist despite years of persecution and attempts by the English to eradicate both language and culture. Just as Europeans attempted to destroy Native American cultures and language, making it illegal to speak native languages in Wales under English rule, people were punished for speaking Welsh. Speakers of English were stigmatised by their English rulers, and the language was seen by the English as directly causing what they believed to be Welsh proclivities towards theft, laziness, and promiscuity. For centuries, Welsh was banned from official use, and in 19th century schools, children caught speaking the language were beaten. The Welsh knot, a heavy piece of wood on a rope, was placed around the necks of any school children who were caught speaking their native language, and they would have to wear it all day. Speaking Welsh was also seen as an impediment to social and economic advancement. The Welsh language was almost wiped out as a result, with only a few people in remote parts of North and West Wales still speaking Welsh as their first language. These negative attitudes towards Welsh only began to change in the last 40 years or so, with various pieces of legislation, the establishment of a devolved National Assembly for Wales, and campaigns by language activists, culminating in the Welsh Language Act of 1993, which gave Welsh in Wales co-official language status with English. Discrimination against Welsh speakers became illegal, and the language became a compulsory part of the Welsh national curriculum. More and more Welsh medium schools have opened since then, with a number of schools being dual language. Parents who don't speak Welsh are sending their children to Welsh nurseries and schools where only Welsh is spoken, such that the children are bilingual from a very young age, and the Welsh Government is putting a lot of money into Welsh language learning opportunities for adults. According to James Griffiths, the Welsh National Language Revival was also instrumental in influencing campaigns to revive other native languages around the world. There's also been a revival of Welsh pre-Christian spirituality, with the Druidic revival and the rise of Welsh witchcraft or Soin traditions. Iolo Morgannwg, the 18th century Welsh antiquarian and poet, who was instrumental in the Druidic revival and the re-establishment of the Eisteddfod in Wales, believed that ancient Druidic tradition in Wales had survived the Roman conquest and the Christian conversion, as well as the persecution of the Welsh bards under Edward I and oppression by the English. He believed that it had survived in the stories, folk tales, and myths preserved by the medieval Welsh bards and often recorded by Christian monks. He believed that an understanding of the language is important for understanding the mindset of the Welsh myths, poems, and culture. Welshness, however, does not have to refer solely to those with ancient British DNA. As Christopher Hughes, head of the Anglesey Druid Order, argues, rather it is the cultural line rather than the bloodline which counts, and there are immigrants to Wales who have fully adopted Welsh culture and language. Welshness is an attitude and a culture, rather than your DNA. The Welsh myths and poetry, such as those preserved in the Mabinogion, the Welsh triads, the Book of Taliesin, and the Songs of Taliesin, preserve traditions about native deities and spirits which are tied to the landscape of Britain. The stories reflect a deep mystery and secret teachings of native traditions which span thousands of years, although they also have some common mythological patterns which can be recognised within the myths of other cultures. So I'm going to look now at some of those themes that can be recognised across mythology. Joseph Campbell discussed the way that myths develop, evolve, and shape culture, and called it the mythogenetic process. His ideas had much in common with the ideas of Carl Jung and his depth psychology and discussion of archetypes and the collective unconscious. Both Jung and Campbell have, however, been criticised for applying Western ideas to diverse cultures and in their attempts to find universal meaning and psychological constructs which can be applied to the whole human race, reducing indigenous cultures and their myths to commodities to be studied from the outside through the Western lens, rather than the lived experience of the people themselves. There has been a tension between the search for shared meaning, which can be applied universally to the whole human race, and the specific and diverse cultural narratives, which reflect the practices and psyches of specific groups of people. The cultural significance of myths has been disrupted due to globalization and cultural appropriation, and local stories are overshadowed by dominant ideologies, which can erode the distinctiveness of the culturally specific local stories. The need to make stories universally acceptable in a globalist world can erode the symbolic depth of the myth and disconnect them from the land and the culture they originated in. So we do have to be careful when examining myths through the lens of universality or through Jungian psychology. However, Campbell argued that myths have a profound connection to experience of the local environment, and that they emerge organically from the specific cultural conditions of the communities which create them, and that these are intertwined with the natural world and survival, as well as shared cultural values. Myths preserve a shared cultural wisdom, guidance as to how to live within the native environment, and how to navigate the social mores of the society. Local myths also reflect the immediate geography within which they arise, and reflect the lived experience of the myth makers as they negotiate their natural environment. Myths also create a sense of identity and belonging to specific communities, with shared stories which span generations. Campbell argued that myths have a psychological function and provide a bridge between the individual and the society and culture in which they live, as well as with the natural world. Myth can articulate both the diversity of human experience and the common threads which unite us all, enriching our understanding of ourselves and of each other. Whilst archetypes may be universal, their expressions are culturally specific. Rob Watson, 2024, argues that mythology serves as a powerful unifying force, harmonising the various dimensions of human experience into a coherent and meaningful whole. At its core, mythology provides a cosmological framework that situates human life within the broader context of the universe, offering a sense of order and purpose. By articulating the relationship between the individual, the community, and the cosmos, myths create a symbolic bridge that connects the personal with the universal, fostering a sense of belonging and meaning. Myths, then, can be said to have a universal psychological function and interpretation, as well as being culture-specific, expressing values, ethical principles, and binding the culture from which they emerge together. Myths also have several levels of meaning and interpretation: cultural, historical, sociological, psychological and mystical, and phenomenological. And like symbols, they always mean more than is immediately obvious. A full understanding of Welsh myth would require immersion in Welsh culture and language, and familiarity with the history and landscape within which the myths emerged. Certain universal archetypes, as outlined by Jung, however, can be identified in the myths, such as the trickster, the shadow, and the twins or siblings, which are related archetypes expressing duality, and which I'll be discussing now in the rest of this presentation. So in his work, The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, Jung has a chapter entitled On the Psychology of the Trickster Figure, in which he refers to the devil in Christian myth and folklore, who is often portrayed as a simpleton who is fooled or cheated. In the medieval church, the devil is referred to as the ape of God, a figure of ridicule who is not simply evil, but is in some way in the service of God. Jung compares this to the alchemical figure of Mercurius, who is not to be confused with the Roman god Mercury, but who carries out jokes and malicious pranks and is a shapeshifter, but is also half divine, half animal. Jung argues that Mercurius seems like a daemonic being resurrected from more primitive times. Jung discusses the figure of the simpleton in folklore and fairy tales, such as Simple Hans, the negative hero who manages to achieve through his stupidity what others fail to accomplish. And here we have some images of the alchemical figure of Mercurius. Mercurius magazine online describes Mercurius in alchemy as a world-creating spirit and vital force, encompassing both light and darkness, good and bad. Mercurius embodies the alchemical process and is associated with, but distinct from, the Greek god Hermes and the Roman Mercury. Mercurius represents the duality of light and dark, good and evil, which is seen as being the beginning and end of the alchemist's journey. Mercurius can be seen to encourage us to keep on living and learning from experience. For light, we need darkness. For wisdom and growth, we need experiences of suffering, as in the Wiccan challenge at first degree initiation, art willing to suffer to learn. Mercurius also encompasses male and female, darkness and light, sun and moon, etc., other and all dualities, and has medicinal powers. Jung compares the character of the trickster to the character of the shaman and medicine man, saying that they also sometimes play malicious jokes on people. Sometimes such tricks are necessary for healing, but the medicine men can also fall foul of them due to repercussions from those they have tricked. Shamanistic techniques themselves often cause the practitioner pain and danger, and initiatory rituals can involve painful and dangerous trials. The wounded wounder becomes the healer, i.e. the wounded healer, and the sufferer takes away suffering, which Jung compares to the figure of Christ in the Christian myth. The trickster figure is instrumental in transforming the meaningless, i.e. suffering, and the meaningful, that is healing, and this has a relationship with the divine. Jung describes the medieval church festivals which preserve elements of the Roman Saturnalia festival, which preserve the trickster archetype, with singing and dancing, masquerades, mumming, indecent and lewd songs, carnival, and a parade of strange characters. Jung argues that where the trickster cycle is still part of culture rather than a remnant, expressed old stories or practices which have lost their meaning, the trickster still functions. Such cultures do not need to theorize about the meaning and purpose of myth. Jung argues that the trickster is the reflection of an earlier, less conditioned, and less civilized stage of human consciousness, and often expresses behaviours that we do not wish to accept or acknowledge, and is thus related to the shadow archetype, though can also be beneficial and helpful to society or people, as well as destructive. Jung argues that this experience of a split-off personality is complementary or compensatory to the ego personality, and is a personification of character traits which are sometimes worse, but sometimes better than the conscious personality possesses. The trickster is a collective personification which is the product of a community, but is recognised and welcomed by each individual as something known to them. When the trickster is a component of the individual, it is the shadow archetype. They can, however, also be a collective shadow, suggesting that the personal shadow is partly descended from some mysterious collective figure. This collective figure dissolves under the impact of civilization, but traces are still left in folklore. Jung said that the trickster cycle preserves the shadow in its unpolluted mythological form, which goes back to an earlier state of consciousness. With developed consciousness, we look back on past states with a level of mockery and contempt. This can be seen even in relatively modern times, when we look back, for example, at 1970s fashion and haircuts and laugh at them. The taste and intelligence of the past may be considered inferior, but at the same time, there's also a common idealisation of the past with reference to the good old days and a golden age. Just as our impression of the past are dualistic in nature, the trickster is also dualistic and is the saviour, and God, man, and beast all in one. The trickster is both subhuman and superhuman, bestial and divine, who is distinguished by his unconsciousness, often acting without thinking and causing trouble for no real reason. Jung says that the trickster is so unconscious that his body is not a unity, and his two hands even fight each other. The trickster can be male or female, and his gender can change. A male trickster can turn himself into a woman and bear children, for example, Loki in Norse myth and Set in Egyptian myth. Or plants can grow from his penis, which is a reference to his original role as creator, the world being made out of the body of a god or a goddess. He can also be an idiot, more stupid than the animals and constantly getting himself into trouble, because he doesn't have the instinct and ability to survive that the animals have, so he is less adapted than animals. Jung says that the trickster is not really evil, but he does do atrocious things due to unconsciousness and unrelatedness. His imprisonment in animal unconsciousness is suggested in myths, but in the end his tricks succeed, bringing him back to being the healer or saviour. In the fourth branch of the Mabinogion, the magician trickster Gwydion is transformed into animals by math. Gwydion is turned by math into various animal forms as punishment for his harmful tricks. But he later acts as saviour to Llywelyn through tricking Arianrhod. Jung says that the trickster is a primitive cosmic being of divine animal nature. On the one hand, superior to man because of his superhuman qualities. On the other hand, inferior because of unreason and unconsciousness. He is, in a sense, inferior to the animals due to his lack of instinct and clumsiness, but such defects are the marks of human nature, being less well adapted to the environment. Jung emphasises the therapeutic value of the repeated telling of myths, pointing out that if the trickster was nothing but the remnants of an earlier and inferior state of consciousness, it would be forgotten. But the trickster continues to amuse us up to the present time. He appears quite often in cartoons, such as Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote. Like the figure of the shadow appearing antagonistically to personal consciousness. The shadow may be disagreeable to the conscious mind and is repressed into unconsciousness, but Jung argues that the repressed contents have the most chances of survival. However, in tribal cultures, the trickster may be seen as pleasurable rather than disagreeable, and not conducive and not repressed. And the myths are actively told and enjoyed, keeping the trickster figures conscious. With progressive civilization, the baser aspects of myths may be transformed and the motif becomes rendered more harmless over a very long period of time. But there is still a secret attraction and fascination towards the primitive for the conscious mind. Thus, there is, according to Jung, a gradual civilization or a gradual civilizing, assimilating of a primitive daimonic figure who was originally autonomous and even capable of causing possession, spirit possession, that is. The darkness, destruction, and evil characteristics are repressed into the unconscious, but the shadow waits for an opportunity to reappear as a projection. The shadow can be dangerous. And when masses get together and the individual is submerged, the shadow can be mobilized and personified and incarnated. The myth of the trickster, according to Jung, was preserved and developed in order to have a therapeutic effect. It preserves a lower intellectual and moral development to remind us of how things were in the past. Two contrary urges are at play: the desire to escape from the earlier condition and the desire not to forget it. Jung quotes Radin, who said that the history of civilization is largely the attempts of man to forget his transformation from an animal into a human being. Although outwardly people may be more or less civilized, inwardly we are still primitives and we still have that animal nature. Jung describes a polarized structure of the psyche. The psyche is our only immediate object of experience. Mythological figures have an autonomy which can both repel and fascinate us. The trickster, according to Jung, is a collective shadow figure. It contains all the inferior traits of character of people. The shadow, although a negative figure, is associated with other archetypes, such as the anima and animus, who can be the source of inspiration, guidance, and strength, and to the sage or wise old man, wise old lady. And the trickster embodies characteristics of the wise person as well as the fool. The trickster, like Hermes in Efnysien, can also be a character associated with repressed peoples, particularly slaves. And to the oppressed, the trickster is often a hero and a saviour. The duality of the trickster figure is often expressed in myth in tales of siblings or twins, where one sibling is peaceful and good, whereas the other is troublesome and bad. In ancient Egyptian mythology, for example, the gods Osiris and Set embody this duality. Sometimes twins or siblings are seen as expressing two halves of a whole, or as being rivals. This is expressed in Welsh myth, in the characters of the brothers Efnysien and Efnysien in the second branch of the Mabinogi of Branwen, daughter of Lear. Branwen and Bran, also known as Bendigeid Fran or Bran the Blessed, and Manawydan are the children of Clear and Penarddun. Efnysien and Efnysien are their half-brothers, sons of Penarddun by a different father, Euryswydd. Lear is mentioned in the Welsh triads as being one of the three exalted prisoners of the islands of Britain, the others being Mabon, son of Modron, who was rescued from imprisonment in a tower by King Arthur in the tales of Culhwch and Olwen, and Gwyr, son of Geiriodd, who little else is known about. Clear was held captive by Euryswydd, and his fathering of Efnysien and Efnysien upon Clear's wife, Penarddun, may therefore have been a result of rape, so not a good start in life. Nevertheless, Efnysien is described as a good lad, who could make peace between two armies when they were the most enraged, whereas Efnysien could cause two of the most loving brothers to fight. The story unfolds as a tragedy in which two great kingdoms, that of Britain and that of Ireland, are totally destroyed, all as a result of Efnysien's behaviour. Efnysien acts impulsively, without reason, and brings total destruction as a result of his actions. Matholwch, the King of Ireland, has come to Britain to visit Bendigeid Fran, who is the High King of Britain and is invested with the Crown of London. He and his fleet land on the coast of Harlech in North Wales, where Bran is sitting at one of his courts outdoors because Bran is a giant of a man who no house can contain. Matholwch has come to ask for Branwen's hand in marriage in order to forge a relationship of peace between the two kingdoms. Efnysien's first abominable act within the story is the mutilation of Matholwch's horses, attacking them and cutting off their ears to the skulls, their lips to their teeth, their tails to their backbones, and even their eyelids, such that they're no good for anything and have to be destroyed. He acts impulsively, with no good reason other than that he's angry that his half-sister Branwen has been given away in marriage to the Irish king without his permission. Thus, Efnysien does something atrocious due to his unconsciousness and unrelatedness, and without thinking of the consequences. His terrible act understandably greatly offends the Irish, who are set to leave Britain at once due to the insult, but are given compensation by Bran, including replacing the horses with the finest horses in the land, a rod of silver, a plate of gold, and a magic cauldron which regenerates those who have died in battle, such that they'll be fit to fight again, only will no longer have the power of speech. Satisfied with the compensation, Matholwch leaves Britain with Branwen and returns to Ireland, where Branwen is loved by all. Branwen gives birth to a son, Gwern, which means alder tree, and all is well for the first year. However, the deep hurt that was caused by Efnysien's acts is not forgotten. And after a year, people begin to mutter about it. And Matholwch's foster brothers persuade him to put Branwen aside because the British have insulted Ireland so much, and Branwen is one of them. And so Branwen is insulted for the insult received from the British. Branwen is locked in a tower, and she's made to do all the cleaning and the chores. And every evening, the cook would come up and box her ears, so she was beaten as well. This went on for 3 years, until Branwen trained a starling, taught it to speak, and told it of her brother Bran, then sent it with a message to him. Upon hearing of Bran's fate at the hands of the Irish, Bran is enraged and gathers armies from all the kingdoms of Britain to invade Ireland, leaving only 7 noblemen behind, with his son Caradog in charge. Bran, being a giant, wades across the sea, as no ship can contain him, leading his fleet. The Irish, upon seeing the vast British army and the huge, immense figure of Bran approaching, retreat across the River Liffey and burn the bridge, believing that the British will not be able to cross the river as it is too rocky for their ships to pass. Bran, however, says, "He who shall be a leader shall also be a bridge," and lies across the river, allowing his armies to cross over on his body. The Irish then meet with him, and Matholwch offers apologies for the way Branwen has been treated, and puts on a big feast for Bran and his army, building a hall big enough to contain Bran, which he has never had before, an offering to Bran to appease him. And Matholwch says that he will invest Gwern, Branwen's son and Bran's nephew, with the kingship of Ireland. However, leather sacks have been hung on all the pillars in the hall, and within each of the leather sacks is an Irish warrior hiding. Efnysien goes into the hall first, and he asks one of the Irishmen, "What's in the bags?" And he's told by the Irishman, "Flour." Efnysien then feels the bag and feels for the head of the warrior and crushes it in his bare hand, crushing through the skull and the brain, and thus killing the warrior. He then goes to the next bag and asks an Irishman, "What's in the bag?" And the Irishman tells him, "Flour." And Efnysien then crushes that next warrior's head, and he goes through all of them until all the warriors are dead. The Welsh and Irish armies then both enter, and the feast begins, the Irish seemingly unaware of the fact that Efnysien has killed all the hidden warriors, and there's no more mention in the story of the hidden warriors and the surprise attack that was planned. Gwern, Bran's son, is invested with the kingship, and everyone loves the boy, and all seems fine. Bran, Manawydan, and Nisien all greet and hug Gwern, and Efnysien then asks if the boy won't come to him also, as he too would like to greet and hug him. And Bran says, "Yes, of course," and sends Gwern over to Efnysien. But when Gwern comes to Efnysien, Efnysien says to himself, "I confess to God the outrage I shall now commit is one the household will never expect." And with that, he grabs Gwern by the feet and hurls him headfirst into the fire. Again, Efnysien has committed an atrocity with no good reason, and knows he is doing so, yet is unable to stop himself. All hell then breaks loose as the two armies all jump up and fight each other. Bran holds Branwen to his shoulder, protecting her with his shield. The Irish have the advantage of the cauldron of regeneration, allowing all their dead to rise again. So Efnysien, finally accepting responsibility for the trouble that he has caused, decides to make right the wrong and hides among the dead Irish, so that he is thrown into the cauldron along with the corpses of the dead. Once inside the cauldron, He pushes hard against the sides until it eventually breaks into 4 pieces. But in the effort of pushing and breaking it, his heart also is torn apart, and he dies. This allows the Welsh to win the war, but in reality there's no winners because there's been complete devastation and destruction of both armies. Only 7 men remain alive of the Welsh army, and all the Irish army is destroyed. The 7 men plus Branwen return to the island of the mighty, that is Britain, but Bran has been shot in the foot with a poisoned arrow and has an incurable wound. He instructs his men to cut off his head and to carry it with them, telling them that it will be as good company to them as he ever was when he was alive. Branwen looks out to the sea and to Ireland, thinks about all the destruction that has occurred, and that 2 great kingdoms have been laid to waste because of her, and her heart breaks, and she dies. Bran, his head is carried by his people, and he still gives instruction to them and is good company to them despite his suffering and his wound. He is therefore the archetype of the wounded healer. Branwen is an archetype of a compassionate anima figure. She takes the blame for things that are not her fault, and she dies of grief. The fault is Efnysien's, but Branwen dies of grief for all that has happened, which she believes is because of her. The men then meet some travellers who tell them what has become of the kingdoms of Britain whilst they were away. The 7 nobles Bran left in charge had been attacked by Caswellen, and most of them killed, whilst Caradog, Bran's son, died of a broken heart, seeing them destroyed. Thus, despite Efnysien dying in his efforts to break the cauldron, his influence still persists. His influence continues even after his death, in the continued destruction which is wreaked upon the land. Christopher Hughes, in the Book of Celtic Magic, describes Nisien and Efnysien as the twins of light and shadow. Their father, Euroswyth's name means golden enemy, and it was he who was responsible for imprisoning Bran and Branwen's father, Lear. Although we are told that Nisien is good, little more is mentioned of Nisien, the twin of light in the tale, and Efnysien takes over. By mutilating the horses of the King of Ireland, he directly attacks the sovereignty of the land. He is hostile, unruly, and uncontrollable, the destructive shadow archetype unleashed. Hughes says, but like it or not, he is a part of all of us. This demigod is a vital teacher. By recognising Efnysien within ourselves, those destructive and uncontrolled forces of darkness, we can make sense of our own psyches. Efnysien acts in an extreme way and represents the unleashed power of the shadow, which demands to be free regardless of any consequences. But repression of the shadow only makes it stronger. And it is the shadow that has not been recognised or listened to which can burst out in a destructive rage and cause carnage. If we get to know our shadow, to listen to it, then we can integrate it and work with it. Efnysien wanted to be heard. He was angry about not being consulted. Hughes says that giving the shadow the voice it needs in a controlled and honourable manner will serve to pacify it and prevent its uncontrollable escape. Attempt to crush it, to ignore it, and it will rise in a tumult of destructive energy. The trickster, according to Jung, does atrocious things due to unconsciousness and unrelatedness, and this is expressed in the character of Efnysien. In the end, his tricks succeed, bringing him back to being the saviour of sorts, in that it is Efnysien who breaks the cauldron of regeneration, preventing the Irish from winning the war. However, this can be seen as too little too late, as both armies are destroyed. Efnysien represents not just the trickster, who is also a saviour figure, but the unleashed destructive power of the shadow. So Efnysien has mutilated Matholwch's forces, causing the war in the first place. And then when peace was about to be made, he throws Gwern, Matholwch and Branwen's son, onto the fire for no reason, causing the battle to break out. But he kind of saves the day by breaking the cauldron of regeneration, allowing the Cymry to win the battle. But too little, too late. Only 7 men remain of the Welsh army, and of those, Bran dies and has to have his head cut off. Another character in Welsh myth who expresses the trickster archetype in a less destructive form is the flawed magician, Gwydion, who appears in the 4th branch of the Mabinogi. Gwydion too causes a war due to his own selfish plans. Math, son of Mathonwy, king of Gwynedd in North Wales, when not at war, cannot live unless his feet rest in the lap of a maiden. His footholder is a maiden called Gyrwyn, who his nephew Gil Faithwy is besotted with, and is pining away because he cannot have her. Gwydion thus causes a war through his trickery, making Math go to war and leave Gyrwyn behind, who the brothers then take by force. Upon Math's return, Math realises what has happened, that his footholder is no longer a maiden, that she has been defiled, and he punishes Gwydion and Gilfaethwy by turning them first into a deer and a stag, then into a sow and a boar, and then into male and female wolves. They're each animal for a year, and they swap genders each time. And when they are animals, they are forced to mate with each other and produce offspring, who Math then turns back into human form. Eventually, they're both turned back into human form by Math. Gwydion's transformation into various different animals, as well as the changing of gender, express the complex nature of the trickster archetype. So we can see there that sorry, a little bit of a glitch there. So to recap, Gwydion and his brother were transformed into various different animals. They had to mate with each other and produce offspring, and had to give their offspring to Math. Eventually, they're both turned back into human form by Math. Gwydion's transformation into various different animals, as well as the changing of gender, express the complex nature of the trickster as described by Jung. Unlike Efnysien, however, who expresses the violent dark shadow, Gwydion can be caring, compassionate, and helpful, as is demonstrated by him caring for his baby nephew, who has been disowned by the boy's mother, Gwydion's sister, Arianrhod. Arianrhod puts a geisha, a curse, on the boy that he should never have a name unless she gives it to him, should never bear arms unless she is the one to arm him, and should never have a wife born of mortal woman. Gwydion manages to deceive Arianrhod through magic and tricks, and tricks her into naming the boy Llaeclaw Guffus, the golden-haired boy with the skillful hand, and into giving him arms. But as they're unable to trick Arianrhod into giving Llay a wife, Gwydion and Math conjure a woman out of flowers, called Blodeuwydd, meaning flower-faced, who subsequently betrays Llay and plots to kill him with her lover Gronw. The wounded Llay is turned into an eagle and flies away. Gwydion goes searching for Llay, finds him in a tree and sings an englyn, a magical poetic song, bringing clay, the light, down the tree, then transforms him back into human shape and heals him. Despite his flaws and bad actions at the beginning of the story, Gwydion redeems himself throughout the story, showing great love and care for his nephew, Clay, though he also takes revenge, turning Blodeuwydd into an owl. Unlike Efnysien, who acts without thinking, Gwydion's actions are thought out and planned, though at the beginning are not always wise or ethical. In contrast to his uncle Math's wisdom and greater magical ability, Gwydion comes across in the story as far less experienced than Math, who expresses the archetype of the sage, and Gwydion expresses the folly of youth and inexperience, as well as at the beginning being self-centered. He does bad things due to, in Jung's words, his unconsciousness and unrelatedness, and then is imprisoned by Math in animal unconsciousness. But in the end, his tricks succeed, and Gwydion becomes the saviour and healer to Clay, singing the light back into the world. So the above is only one interpretation of the characters of Efnysien and of Gwydion in the Mabinogion. And this is one based on the universal archetypal theories of Carl Jung. It's not, however, the only interpretation, and the myths of the Mabinogi are rich in content and symbolism, expressing great mysteries, as well as aspects of Welsh culture and a connection with the sacred landscape of Britain. So it's the end of my presentation. I've put up here just a list of some of the references that I made in the talk, if you're interested in exploring them any further. Thanks for listening and watching. And if you liked this video, if you found it interesting, please like and subscribe to my channel. My channel does have a mix of academic presentations as well as practical spiritual matters. Thanks for watching.